Our university and community supporters, the University of Iowa International Programs, and the university's honors program. They contribute vital time, talent, and logistics to our organization. Also, thanks very much to the Stanley University of Iowa Foundation Support Organization for their financial support. And I thank today's special sponsors, Heidi Gaylor and Bridget and Adam Ingersoll. I also thank City Channel 4 for professionally recording our programs for cablecast on City Channel 4 or 118-2, as well as in the University of Iowa Library's digital archives. Please be sure to like City Channel 4 on Facebook. The format today is our usual one. Following our speaker's presentation at roughly 1 p.m., we'll have a 15-minute Q&A from written questions submitted by our audience members. You can write your questions on the cards that are at your table. The cards will be collected at the conclusion of our speaker's remarks. Now, please silence your cell phones if you haven't already and other electronic devices. Also, if you do need to leave early, I ask that you please do so quietly and without disturbing others. Okay, so now it's my great pleasure to introduce Janice Weiner. She was born and raised in Iowa City and moved back here in 2013, following nearly 26 years in the U.S. Foreign Service. Janice graduated Magna cum laude from Princeton University with a degree in Comparative Literature and subsequently earned a JD from Stanford University Law School. She speaks German, Turkish, French, Polish, and conversational Spanish and Dutch. Janice's Foreign Service assignments included 2 tours in Germany, another 2 in Ankara, Turkey, plus Belgium and Mexico City. Janice also worked as a legislative management officer in the Bureau of Legislative Affairs prior to her retirement. Please join me in welcoming today Janice Weiner.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you all for coming today. It's a great crowd. I feel like I need to give you 2 caveats. I feel like I'm just coming up for air right now. I worked for 3 months very intensively on a political campaign and just stopped that activity a couple of days ago. And so I'm trying to reconnect with the world and what's going on. And then as a result of that, I came down with something, so my voice may be a little odd at times. And finally, I would like to, in advance, potentially apologize to the Turks who are in the room here. If you have disagreements or you have a different point of view, I'd love to hear it afterwards. What I am going to, the talk that I'm going to give you today is sort of based on my total of 6 to 7 years of experience working in Turkey and on Turkish issues and watching from afar. I still have good friends there, and I contact them to see how they view what's going on. And I just care about Turkey very much. As you would have gathered from the title, I am not very optimistic about the current state of democracy in Turkey. And what I want to do is look at this today through the lens of a quick romp through Turkish history, or the history of the Turkish Republic, because I believe it can give us some clues as to why Turkey is where it is today. Turkey, or rather Turkish democracy, is, as I said, not in a very good place. A few years ago, I would have given you a completely different answer. When I went to Turkey for my second tour from 2005 to 2008, I returned to a Turkey that was radically transformed from the country that I had known in the mid-90s. The conflict with the PKK was basically in abeyance. The economy was going gangbusters. The currency had been stabilized. There were enormous new freedoms of expression. There was real progress toward potential membership in the EU. I stood back and said, this is a different place than I knew. And until a couple of years ago, there were negotiations ongoing to end the conflict with the PKK. There was real, tangible progress toward potential EU membership, even if the European Union or certain of its countries didn't seem too enthusiastic about it. A number of laws were changed. The death penalty was repealed. Freedom of expression had been greatly expanded. Language rights, including Kurdish language rights, had been expanded. The media were vibrant. It was no longer the state-run Turkish radio and television. There was a full spectrum of media operating. That is not the case any longer. I would say there is no hope of negotiations at this point with the PKK. The EU hopes are pretty much dead, in my view, and the media is constantly under assault. So what happened? President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and the AK Party, which is the Turkish acronym for the Justice and Development Party, happened. That party and what it brought to Turkish politics seemed so positive for so many years, those of you who watch Turkey may say. Yes, it did, and yes, it was. So to get to what happened, I hope you'll indulge me if I go back basically to the beginning of the history of the Turkish Republic. It was established really against all odds in 1923 out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, thanks to Mustafa Kemal and his ragtag Anatolian army. Mustafa Kemal became known as Ataturk, father of the Turks, and he was the father of modern Turkey. He built a country out of the ruins of an empire where literacy was extremely low and was the exclusive province, essentially, of the imams. He built a country out of a place that had few natural resources and few accoutrements of a modern nation state. So he started from scratch. He adopted European codes of law and dress. He moved the capital away from decadent Istanbul, which was synonymous with the sultans and the decline of the Ottoman Empire, to Ankara in central Anatolia. He was enormously suspicious of religion, and so established what in our terms we would call a secular state, although the word secular doesn't work that well. He cut the Islamic clergy off at the knees. He banned the fez, which had made it the headgear that had made it easy to pray, and he changed the alphabet from Arabic to the Latin alphabet literally overnight. I mean, can you imagine? He had a brand new cadre of secular teachers trained, men and women, that was radical as well, and sent them all over the fledgling country. So no longer did the imams have a hold on education because they didn't know the new alphabet and they were no longer those who would be the ones teaching. He gave women the vote. He brought people into the towns and cities and down from the mountains to adopt a last name. No longer would just a mere honorific and a first name do. They needed to take on all the accoutrements of an aspiring European country. He created a highly centralized state structure with a parliament in Ankara and provinces whose governors were and still are appointed from Ankara, not elected. He controlled the reins of power. Ataturk revered European culture. He had an opera built and universities and created a ministry to keep control of religious life. He banned Islamic tarikats, Islamic orders. The economic model he used was statist. It was controlled from above, and there was a 5-year plan. And he also nurtured and created an army to protect this fledgling country that prided itself on its professionalism. It had helped create this country out of the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, and it would preserve it. After Ataturk died in 1938, his fellow general İsmet İnönü became president until a multi-party system was introduced in 1950. In other words, this is a very gross overview of Turkish history, and I apologize for that. But in other words, when I look at this, back at Turkish history, I see a man who, through the force of his will and personality, pulled together modern Turkey. he was, and I hope the Turks in the audience will forgive me, something of a benevolent dictator, and in many ways the ultimate cult of personality. But without him, modern Turkey would not exist. So my premise is essentially that Ataturk created modern Turkey almost out of whole cloth, a republic, and the beginnings of a democracy created from the top down, not from the grassroots up. There was probably no other way at the time, but that one fact that it was created from the top down is, in my view, key to understanding much of what has happened there since. The political class that emerged in Turkey after Ataturk and İnönü was weak, often inept, often corrupt, and the antithesis of true leadership. Each leader of a party had a party created in his own image. They were in many ways more fan clubs than vehicles for serious political action. Each was a one-man show, whether it was Bülent Ecevit, Süleyman Demirel, or Necmettin Erbakan. The parties doled out jobs and packed the state bureaucracy with their cronies. They squabbled, and the parliament was a sea of shifting coalitions. There really was no grassroots politics. There was very little in the way of responsible civilian leadership. The contrast with the Turkish military was stark. The army prided itself on its order and was for decades by far the most trusted institution in Turkey. 3 times, the military took over the government, in essence, to save it from the inept politicians. And 3 times, it handed control of the reins of government back, largely to those self-same politicians. After the 1980 coup, when society had come very close to disintegrating and the populace really did welcome intervention, the military eventually wrote a new, quite restrictive constitution that passed by referendum in 1982. The usual suspects were banned from running for office for a period, and Turgut Özal, a technocrat, became prime minister and later president. He proved to be somewhat of the exception to the rule. He was a charismatic figure who again pushed the country forward, literally electrifying much of the country that had not seen electricity before, lifting exchange controls, and liberalizing trade in a move toward free markets, and edging towards some sort of recognition of Turkey's Kurdish population, which is estimated to be maybe 20% of the population, but I mean, I'm not sure who really knows. He also cooperated with the US and the United Nations in the first Persian Gulf War. He too eventually was charged with wanting to be an autocrat, and then he died unexpectedly. And then the regular suspects came back into government. At the time, though, Anatolia itself was awakening. It was flexing its economic muscle. People were moving from the countryside into the cities, creating large cities on the outskirts of the city, so-called gecekondu, houses or housing thrown up overnight, at least by legend, according to an old Ottoman law that allowed people to squat on property if they were able to construct a dwelling overnight. Istanbul swelled beyond recognition. Many of the people who inhabited the outer reaches of the city were pious. They were from Anatolia. They were looking for a way forward. City services such as water, sewage, and electricity didn't exist initially. They built the houses and the dwellings, and eventually the services came to them. Throughout this period, a series of Islamist and Kurdish-based parties would form and then be banned, and then reform under a slightly related name with the same people, for the most part, in charge. Both were seen as antithetical to the unity and secular nature of the Turkish Republic, which explain the degree to which they struggled to get a foothold and purchase. So it's into this atmosphere that Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who was born and raised in the hardscrabble Istanbul neighborhood of Kasımpaşa, came. He was a semi-professional soccer player who came along with many of Islamist Necmettin Erbakan's followers into the Welfare Party. And he gradually rose through the ranks in the city of Istanbul until in 1994, he was elected metropolitan mayor with just a plurality of the votes, around 25%. Many initially feared his Islamist bent, but while metropolitan mayor of Istanbul, Erdogan worked pragmatically. He tackled the city's water shortage, its pollution problems, its traffic chaos, and its garbage problem, for example, by creating an enormous state-of-the-art recycling facility. And he established a mayor's roundtable. His party, probably partly at his behest and partly because of the religious background, started to help the poor in the gecekondos, in these sort of slum-type areas, but it's hard to describe them because they weren't really slums. It was all these little houses that looked like the houses in Anatolia that they rebuilt on the edges of the city. But they began to help these newcomers to Istanbul with welcome wagon-like assistance, something that hadn't been seen before. And that was what I saw as one of the beginnings of real grassroots movement and assistance, as religious communities often help those in need. So 3 years later, in 1997, Erdogan recited a poem off in the far eastern city of Siirt, in which he spoke a verse that was apparently not in the original poem, but he referred to, quote, "The mosques as our barracks, the domes our helmets, the minarets our bayonets, and the faithful our soldiers." And he was accused, under a then notorious section of the Turkish Penal Code, of incitement to violence and religious or racial hatred, and convicted and spent 10 months in prison. He was forced to give up his mayorship, and a political ban of a number of years was imposed. But he was really just beginning. In 2001, with a number of others, Erdogan established the Justice and Development Party. Its Turkish acronym is AK. It won in a landslide in the 2002 parliamentary elections. Turkey had just gone through an enormous financial crisis. They were coming out of it, but the governments had just proven, for the most part, quite inept, and there was real appetite for change. However, Erdogan was not yet able to hold elective office. He was still under a ban. So when AK initially took power in 2002, Abdullah Gül became the prime minister and head of government. There was a by-election then, the following February out in Siirt. Erdogan's ban had been lifted, and he became deputy in parliament, and then Gül ceded the prime minister's seat to Erdogan, which Erdogan would then hold for the following 10 years. So the Justice and Development Party, whose acronym AK means clean or white in Turkish, really began as a big tent party, and really the closest to a grassroots party that I think Turkey has ever seen. The initial governing years also reflected that. The trio of Abdullah Gül as foreign minister, a very cultivated man, soft-spoken man, who struck the world as reasonable, spoke good English, had experience outside of the country. Abdulatif Şener from the eastern Anatolian city of Sivas, headed another wing of the party. And a Kurd from Mersin, Dengirmir Mehmet Fırat, served as a close advisor to Erdogan. Fırat was from also a very famous Kurdish family. So to me, it looked, for that period, it was as if these three men serving with Erdogan formed essentially the three legs of a stool that helped keep AK stable, open, and provided a counterbalance to Erdogan's potentially more authoritarian and more mercurial personality. The parliament passed pragmatic programs, as had been the case when Erdogan was mayor of Istanbul. Wells were dug in villages, schools were built, roads were paved. So people in Turkey's southeast, for example, saw improvements to their lives, saw the government contribute to improvements in their lives, something that most had never seen in their living memory. All of a sudden, they could get, no matter the weather, from their small town to the largest city nearby, largest town nearby, because the road had been paved. All of a sudden, they had water in their village, or they had a school that was built or rebuilt where there had been no school before. There were infrastructure projects, jobs. They worked at cleaning up the gecekondu's. They took advantage of a stabilized currency. They pushed for European Union membership, changing some of the most restrictive parts of the 1982 military written constitution. They freed up freedom of expression, decriminalized the use of the Kurdish language, and eliminated the death penalty. What could go wrong? Well, Erdogan and AK kept winning elections. And they would admit when I would talk to some of them that they thought that they would be a better party if there were a robust opposition, but there never really was a robust opposition to them. It seemed to me as if no other party could really figure out the conundrum of grassroots politics there, except maybe the Kurds. And the legs of that stool that I spoke of earlier wobbled. Abdulatif Şener disagreed with Erdogan, got tired of having to serve him, and stepped down. Abdullah Gül was promoted to president, a largely ceremonial position. And Fırat finally stepped down as well. No one from that strong inner circle was left to put the brakes on Erdogan. And he brought more and more of those who agreed with him, whom he had groomed, and who would not disagree with him into government. It was around that point that the Erdogan government brought a legal case against a number in the military that's referred to as the Ergenekon case, which ended up, it had to do with various conspiracies and the so-called deep state in Turkey, which I've never really understood and won't go into. But the end result was that it discredited many in that revered institution and really weakened the military. And then Erdogan had an enormous new presidential palace built in Ankara. Starting relatively early on, Erdogan brought lawsuits against political cartoonists and journalists, anybody who was really critical of him. That was always a puzzle to me, and it's still a puzzle to me. I mean, he was someone who himself was jailed for voicing unpopular opinions, and yet there he was trying to jail anyone who essentially caricatured him, skewered him, or really disagreed with him. His circle shrank. He got himself elected president, which, as I had said, is supposed to be a largely ceremonial position, but he is still running the show, and his goal has been to change the Constitution to give the president actual powers. In the last election, the Kurdish party, to the surprise of many, made it over the 10% parliamentary threshold, essentially robbing Erdogan of the majority his party would have needed in order to change the constitution and make his wish a reality. So at some point, even some of those closest to him had it. Ahmet Davutoğlu was who was first a foreign policy advisor, and then foreign minister, and then became prime minister. Finally had it and stepped down. And I challenge any of you who are not perhaps really into Turkish politics to name the current Turkish prime minister. Anyone? There's a man named Binali Yildirim, who is simply one of the people from the AK party who will now do, in my view, Erdogan's bidding. So fast forward to July 15th and the failed old-style coup attempt. It was a bizarre coup attempt in that whoever tried to carry it out was really trying to carry out an old-style coup attempt. I mean, Turkey is way past the days where you can take over the state-run television and shut down the media. And in fact, the media that night proved to be, whom Erdogan had already tried to defang, proved to be Erdogan's greatest ally, as were the fellow political parties. He was able to get on his iPhone and FaceTime with a journalist in CNN Turk studios and another studio who broadcast this to the nation, who broadcast Erdogan's call for people to get out into the streets, for people to oppose the attempted coup. And in an astonishing show of people power, that's what people did. They poured out onto the streets. They challenged the military on Istanbul's bridges and in Ankara. And unfortunately, there was substantial bloodshed. Over 250 people died. But the coup attempt failed. And part of the reason it failed was that not just people came out, but the heads of all the political parties came out and made statements essentially saying, yes, we have issues and we have problems, but this is not the way to resolve them. If we have another military coup in Turkey, it's going to set the country back a decade or more, and that's not what we want. And that might have been the end of it. But almost as soon as the coup was put down, and numerous members of the military were initially taken into custody, which was not unexpected, a much larger crackdown then started. And I don't have the figures or the numbers, but since then, literally tens of thousands, at least 10,000 or more, have been civil servants, prosecutors, academicians, and so forth, have been relieved of their jobs, purged, many of them taken into custody. Parliament gave Erdogan and the government emergency powers in the immediate aftermath of the coup, which the first time the entire country and all its provinces had been under a state of emergency back in the 1990s. When they were battling the PKK, there was a state of emergency that kept being renewed that comprised 10 provinces in Turkey's southeast. And that was always a sore point for allies, including the U.S. Now they had a state of emergency because of the coup that essentially covers the entire country. It was re-upped and somewhat expanded at the end of October. And to me, very ominous things happened, in addition to a number of media outlets, largely Kurdish and opposition, being closed. One of the country's longest lived and most respected newspapers, Cumhuriyet, which means republic, the editor of that, its chief cartoonist, Musa Kart, who's been around forever, and 9 others were taken into custody. And around the same time, the 2 leaders of the Kurdish party in parliament were also taken into custody. Reminiscent of the 1990s, all the members of that party in parliament had their immunity lifted by parliament a couple of months ago, and now Selahattin Demirtas, who is a young and charismatic human rights attorney from Diyarbakir, whom I knew when I was there, and his fellow leader are in custody. Erdogan blamed the coup, has attempted to blame the coup largely on an Islamic cleric named Fethullah Gulen, who has been living in Pennsylvania for years, is in frail health. Gulen eventually came out and denied that he had anything to do with it. But to link, for example, the editorial staff of Cumhuriyet with somehow Fethullah Gulen and his ideas is absurd in the utmost, because Cumhuriyet has been one of the most outspoken papers over the years criticizing Gulen and his schools and his school of thought. So in my view, it's a really sad day for Turkey. And in some ways, it's like Back to the Future. Emergency rule, peace talks with the PKK are gone. The economy is not doing particularly well. The U.S. Embassy has had to put out warnings to American tourists. The families of U.S. Consulate General employees in Istanbul were sent home because of threats. The free press has been gutted. And President Erdogan, apparently in his quest for the votes that the nationalists can potentially bring him to give the presidency greater powers, is mulling bringing back the death penalty, which, by the way, would be the death knell for any dim hopes of joining the EU. I've long said that what Turkey needs more of than anything else is true grassroots politics and a real opposition. That is true now, in my view, more than ever. But what's their model? At this point, the one fledgling democracy in the area, and really the only friend of Israel in the area, is now starting to look more like a Ba'athist regime than a democratic one. So finally, why should we care? Well, Turkey has been a NATO ally on the southern flank since 1952. They've been one of the only stable, friendly regimes in that part of the world. We have multiple times made good use of Incirlik Air Base in southern Turkey. It's been home to a number of missions, including flights that are currently going out over Syria. We have had shared interests in peace and stability in the region and a long history of cooperation. Turkey, for many years, has been really a beacon of success economically with its experiment in democracy in a majority Muslim nation. It has a largely highly educated population. It's worked very closely with the European Union on refugee issues and hosts huge numbers of Syrian refugees itself. It seems to me that we need Turkey, the EU needs Turkey, the Mideast need Turkey, and Turks themselves need a vibrant and democratic Turkey. What I'd like to close with is a couple of paragraphs in an article a longtime friend of mine who still writes for a Turkish newspaper, Asla Aydıntaşbaş, wrote recently in an article that appeared in the Washington Post. She entitled it, "Turkey was once a free country, now the country is rapidly destroying itself." And what Asla said is, with the detention of Demirtas of the Kurdish party and other elected officials, Turkey is propelled back in time and beamed into the darker days of the 1990s, wrought with terrorism, internal conflicts, a struggling economy, and hopelessness. In 1994, a bunch of Kurdish deputies were arrested from the parliament, ushering in a period of violent escalation and repression. You don't want history to repeat itself, and you don't want to be further dragged into the Middle Eastern vortex of authoritarianism, militias, and sectarian and ethnic conflicts. But who will stop the tides and stand up for democracy? Turkish leaders are too selfish to change course. The opposition is too weak. The citizens too scared. There is no candidate yet. This is the stuff history is made of. Sometimes the only thing you can do is watch a country ruin itself, and that's the real tragedy of it all. I desperately hope that Turkey will not turn into that dark place, but unless and until, in my view, the Turks can overcome this history of essentially authoritarian leaders and lack of grassroots movements and robust opposition that can really harness the power of the people, we're going to be rowing in rough seas there. So thank you very much.
I'll begin with an easy one. That's a joke. Do you believe that Erdogan has larger regional ambitions, perhaps to restore the Ottoman Empire?
I have no idea what Erdogan is thinking anymore. Actually, when Ahmet Davutoğlu was just an advisor to him, Davutoğlu always spoke about just wanting to make peace with all the neighboring countries and live in a sort of more congenial neighborhood. Because one thing that you may notice I should have brought a map of Turkey, is the country does not reside in the easiest of neighborhoods. Its neighbors include, in addition to Greece and Bulgaria, Armenia, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, and I'm probably missing one, but it's just not a very, it's not a very easy neighborhood. I think that if he had any of those dreams, they've long since been dashed, and it's difficult for me to imagine, even though I know he would like to participate in the battle for Mosul and maybe get some of that territory dream about getting some of that territory that Turkey never had, and was sort of cut off from it when Turkey was created at the end out of the Ottoman Empire, and all the oil-rich lands were given to Iraq, and the southern border for Turkey was set in the middle of these mountains where you absolutely can't control a border, as opposed to down in the plains closer to Mosul or some of the other currently Iraqi cities where they might have actually enjoyed a little bit of oil riches. But I can't see any of that happening right now.
So the next question is interested in finding out how the Turkish prisons accommodate all the citizens now taken into custody, and whether there's room for them, what happens to them while they're in custody, and what legal processes are involved for them after they've been arrested.
Many were taken into custody. My understanding is that a number of people have been released. More than anything, people have lost their jobs. They've been purged from ministries, purged from universities, purged from academic positions, and that is the issue more than anything. Turkey, I think, probably has sufficient capacity in its prisons, but I don't really think that the prisons are the issue. The issue is how any of these people can hope at some point to get any recourse for what has been taken from them. And I don't know the answer to that. My one caveat is I honestly have just come up for air after 3 months not paying attention to anything but the political campaign. So I have not been following this as closely as I could have or should have.
So the next question concerns the possibility for grassroots political organizing. Are there regional, ethnic, religious, or other potential communities around which to build those kind of movements?
I think some of our Turkish colleagues here could answer that probably better than I can. Yes, there are people who have common interests. There are people who have worked together for years. But the question is now, in this atmosphere, as my friend Asla said in her article, they've shut down access to Facebook. They've shut down access to Twitter. They've shut down access to WhatsApp. But who would dare go onto any of these social media sites to incite to anything right now in the current climate? So I don't. I think it's going to take a while before people are going to feel that they're in any position to try and form any sort of effective opposition. Even my understanding is even that the biggest opposition in Parliament, the Republican People's Party, has been feeling the pressure as well from the Erdogan government. So I'm sure they exist. I've always wondered why they haven't managed to coalesce. Maybe if people really see their country in need, that will form the seeds of some parties or groups for the future.
Maybe a follow-on to that would there be any gain from Turkey moving toward a federated state as part of changing its politics in the future?
In terms of giving more power to the various regions of the country, I have a hard time imagining an Erdogan or any other ruler that tends toward more authoritarian rule wanting to implement something like that. It has long been essentially a shibboleth that they do not want to give greater powers to the regions. It goes way back to the fear of having part of Turkey carved off as a Kurdish state, and to some of the early days of the Turkish Republic when agreements were made among foreign countries that essentially would have carved up the rest of Turkey, and Turkish unity has been one of the indivisible nature of the nation have been some of the rallying cries throughout Turkish history. At this point, that would seem not a realistic option, to me anyway.
We had two people ask about the credibility of rumors or claims that maybe Erdogan was part of a conspiracy to launch the coup so that he could defeat it and begin imprisoning enemies. Do you have any thoughts on that?
If nothing else, Turkey has always been the land of conspiracy theories. And I have no idea if there's any truth to that or not. The one thing I do believe is that Erdogan and some of those close to him had long been compiling lists of people that they would like to purge and like to get rid of were the opportunity ever to come up. I sort of would like to think that he would not go so far as to instigate a coup, but I do believe that he basically knew who he wanted to get out.
How has the flow of refugees from Syria exacerbated the political situation in Turkey?
I mean, the Turks were very generous with refugee camps, but many refugees have just come into various Turkish cities from Gaziantep to Adana and Mersin and throughout the country and made themselves at home. How it's exacerbated it, they've had to put some resources into it. To me, probably the greater problem for Turkey has been the flow of foreign fighters and the fact that for a long time, even though we and others pressed them to close their borders and not allow these foreign fighters to transit into Syria or back out, they did not do so. And I think that is one of the things that has had a substantial impact on the country right now in terms of some of the actors who are present there and some of those who undertake acts of terrorism who are not the PKK, and I think that's in part there because of the lax policy toward thinking essentially we can let them all flow toward there and it won't hurt us, but I think it has hurt them.
All right. Well, Janice, you said you would welcome some of the tough questions. So we do have a question from the audience that wants to press you a little bit on whether democracy is in fact Western-style democracy is in fact the best way forward for Turkey, and whether some of the opposition from the West is really centered around the Erdogan's moves toward Islamic centrism rather than secularism. And so if you have thoughts on those questions.
We've always said that Turkey should find, and other countries should find their own way. I don't think anybody has pretended to tell Turkey what sort of democracy they should have. What was the second part of the question? I'm sorry.
Islamism rather than secularism.
I know that there have always been concerns about what a more Islamist party would do. My own personal concerns about that are far less now with respect to the Islamic content, and far greater with respect to the authoritarian nature of what Erdogan is doing with the country. I believe that a lot of the pushback from Europe over the years, and some of the blocks when Turkey was making much more of a serious effort at applying for European Union membership, were more because of long-standing disagreements, hatreds between Greece and Turkey, Cyprus and Turkey, who were sort of used in some ways, I believe, as sort of convenient blocks for other countries to stand behind or hide behind, so that they wouldn't have to consider really letting this large country into the EU. And there, I'm sure that the specter of not so much of Erdogan, of the AK party or Erdogan, raised its head, but simply the fact that you have a country of however many million it is now, 72 million or more, that's 95% Muslim. And did Europe want that country to be a part of Europe, or see it as potentially a part of Europe? And I think a lot of Europeans, has made a lot of Europeans very nervous. But I don't think it's particularly aimed at Erdogan himself.
Okay, and this will be the final question, and I want you to feel free to consider it optional, I guess, because the question is to extrapolate to the United States and the recent election results. Do you see any possibility of similar trends going on in our country? And since that is off topic, answer as you would like.
There's a lot of extremism going on in the world, and a lot of populism. I leave it to each of you to decide for yourself.
Great. Good answer. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. On behalf of the Iowa City Foreign Relations Council, I do want to again thank Janice Weiner for her presentation today. Let me also once again thank our sponsors, the University of Iowa International Programs, the university's Honors Program, the Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization, all of whom are very generous in supporting us. Today's special sponsors, Heidi Gaylor and Bridget and Adam Ingersoll, and thanks again to City Channel 4 for making our programs available to viewing audiences. So Janet, as a small token of our appreciation, I would like to present with you the coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug. Thanks again, everyone. We're adjourned.